Today we're talking about Native Americans. Interchangeably, we'll use the terms Native Americans as well as American Indians to refer to the indigenous inhabitants of the United States. So, American Indians have the longest tenure of all social groups in the United States and North America, going back roughly 30,000 years. Christopher Columbus termed the indigenous people of North America Indians, thinking and believing that he had landed in the East Indies with no regard for the hundreds of distinct groups and nations and tribes attributed to Native American people. Scholars dispute the rather precise, I should say, number of Native American inhabitants in the U.S. before colonization, and North America, of course, before colonization. Uh, the population has dwindled, or did, I should say, dwindle to less than 250,000 in the aftermath of targeted violence against the American Indian population through disease exposure, war, and the combination of those events have been likened by some scholars and social historians to genocide. So, with colonization, we're looking at and talking about the taking of land by a foreign group or nation, often by force. That process devastated Native American communities and nations. Reservations and forced assimilation were a big part of this process. So, you had mass confining of American Indians to territories that were newly reserved for them. So, that was institutionalized, so made within sort of the fabric of the functioning of the country and the government through and with the passage of the Indian Removal Act of 1830. So this resulted in Native Americans being forced to being removed, if you will, from the vast majority of states and territories east of the Mississippi. Also, by the late 1800s, the U.S. government had policies targeting Native Americans for forced assimilation into cities. In urban areas, to go to the cities, the goal or the idea was by the government that in forcing Native Americans to urban areas, that would reduce social problems seen on reservations, such as poverty and violence. Never mind, I should say, of course, the fact that the creation of the reservation system itself and the forced removal, if you will, and resettlement of Native Americans, those processes are largely responsible for much of what we've seen tragically play out in what we sometimes here refer to as Indian country. So between the 30s and 50s, so that 3 decade span, that government era, those programs strongly emerged, or I should say strongly emerged and of course urged Native Americans to resettle again to these urban areas away from the bonds that they had begun to form and had some continuity in creating with respect to what was happening on reservations. So we also saw Native American or American Indian centers form in these cities, and culturally based jobs programs formed in these cities directed towards Native American populations. The idea was that these job centers and these kinds of cultural centers within these cities would be places that could be gravitational, that would help and aid within the resettlement process for Native Americans. So that legacy of reservation as well as resettlement of sort of rural reservations and urban resettlement. So that's had a very devastating impact on the process of earning income as well as life expectancy and the experience of poverty within Native American communities. And all of this happening in or to varying levels across the entire country. Today, roughly 3 million people are of American Indian or Native American descent, where two conditions must be met to be officially recognized and considered as Native American. That one, number one, has origins in any of the original peoples of North America, so you have Native American or American Indian ancestry. And number two, that you have official recognition and registration through tribal affiliation. So you have that dual condition to be met to be recognized as someone who is Native American. Now, again, ancestry certainly differs from the actual official recognition, so there may often be considered perhaps possibly millions more who have ancestry but have not necessarily claimed or gone the other sort of step and claimed some affiliation with the tribe. And again, tribes, the rules for claiming tribal affiliation will vary from tribe to tribe. Also, the vast majority of Native Americans live in metropolitan areas, as is the case of most U.S. citizens, regardless of ethnicity or race. However, the highest concentrations of Native American populations are found typically in western states such as California, Arizona, as well as New Mexico. So here in the state of Michigan, we typically see our Native American population coalesce in northern lower Michigan as well as in the Upper Peninsula. In terms of intergroup relations, Native Americans' relationships to the dominant white society and government span the entire range of intergroup relations that we've been talking about this semester. So from, for instance, extermination to pluralism. So U.S. government dominance was really established through several concepts, such as the notion of who owns what land and who can lay claim and title to land. And so that was vastly different. The emergence of that by the colonialists was vastly different than that which was considered much more free and much more freely given to society and tribes with respect to Native Americans. Also, weaponry that was used during colonization was technologically sophisticated in such a way that was overwhelming to the process of, if you will, resettlement, and was able to be used as a sort of cudgel in mass to create that process. Also, deliberate disease exposure and legal and physical coercion of Native Americans to boarding schools, reservations, and urban areas. So you had a sort of multifactorial, in a sense, strategy that was effectively used to ultimately control and dominate the, in mass, various tribes and nations of Native American populations. However, we would be remiss to not discuss resistance. So, resistance efforts by Native Americans that often spanned and, if you will, in a lot of respects, transcended various nations and various tribes and cultures. So, we can think of these as pan-Indian movements. So these recognize the shared struggle and oppression regardless of what nation or nations unique tribes were from. So the idea was, okay, let's find a way to get together, find a way to effectively combat what we're seeing as incursion on our lands and on our very culture by the U.S. government. So the idea was that to if you will, scale to this and to have this happen, that there would have to be a sort of we are one, a oneness mentality that directly challenged the U.S. government. So these were observed in a number of different ways and efforts. So, for instance, the tribal, multi-tribe Red Nation efforts during the 1700s, the Battle of Little Bighorn, Geronimo and the Red Power movement, if you will, movements of the 1960s and 1970s. We also see more recent efforts grounded in more global resistance. So notions of global stratification, notions of global oppression, and ways that Native American nations can coalesce around norms towards fighting that, as far as additional recognition and receiving that additional recognition from the United Nations. Also, the Red Power movement invoked the common pattern of nonviolent civil disobedience, so the pattern that was long established therein within the civil rights movement. And so you had protests known as fish-in protests. So these were ways that you'd see protests that were in a way parallel to what you'd see in urban areas, in demonstrations that might take places in cities on plazas or in streets, on blocks. So fish-in protests taking place more along waterways in rural areas, for instance, on lands that were seized from Native Americans. Again, these paralleled a lot of what you'd see in the urban demonstrations happening in cities like Minneapolis, San Francisco, and Chicago. Currently, in terms of resistance, we see Native American activism centering around resisting continued government control and resisting continued government access of land that's been disputed. So there are various lands throughout the country that have been, if you will, in dispute of one kind or another between Native American nations as well as the United States government. There are also efforts to reduce violence, particularly on tribal lands against women, the return of bison, if you will, what some people or some folks refer to as American buffalo, return of those bison to the prairie system, as well as securing health resources to combat health disparities, such as what we've seen incredibly emerge during and after the COVID-19 pandemic. One of the more prominent victories from 4 years ago involved more than 3 million acres of eastern Oklahoma, including much of the city of Tulsa, now being recognized officially as Indian country per federal law. Right? In terms of gender, race, and class, there's a lot of variety with respect to these in terms of what tribal societies experienced. So often norms of Native American tribes, the norms of power and inclusion were in many cases egalitarian for both men and women, particularly prior to contact with the colonialists and Europeans. However, over time, it was revealed, of course, that Europeans did not like trading or transacting with women leaders of Indian tribes. So the colonization pattern, if you will, that the colonialists brought, that really influenced and forced tribes to parallel the white norms of masculinity, so that they could still be able to be recognized and have the power that they were used to. That at least that was what the hope was. That elevated the tribal status and power of men relative to women. Despite this, there's been an intentional effort to promote women to positions, if you will, of power in Native American nations. And so today, for instance, our Secretary of the Interior, Deb Haaland, is the first Indigenous woman appointed to a presidential cabinet. Going forward, continued oppression of Native American women also involved their forced sterilizations on reservations during largely the period between the 70s and 1990s. And so the idea ostensibly was that, well, this was done for supposedly for poverty prevention, but again, we're looking at forced involuntary sterilizations of women during those experiences. Also, the notion of two-spirited persons, the concept of those who are two-spirited, this developed amongst a number of Native American nations, ways of describing gender variant and gender nonconforming individuals in Native American communities. Typically, those referred to as two-spirit or considered as two-spirit are seen as respected and revered members of their communities. So to be two-spirited typically was seen as a revered position of status, a position to be respected, a position that was noteworthy. Also, the adoption of more hierarchical male-centered norms, those again of the colonialists, some tribes adopted these. That was consistent with the severe loss of wealth, power, and prestige by individual and collective tribes. Modern efforts to reverse these trends can be seen in the growth of casinos on Native American reservations. Nevertheless, Native Americans are much more likely to suffer from poverty than members of other racial and ethnic groups in the United States.